So let's start with Clausewitz. Um, and one of the things I want to do is point out what you've actually done, what you're actually reading. You're reading. You read Gray, which is actually on Colin Gray, who recently passed away, actually earlier this year, who's actually a famous strategist in the modern sense, a regular consultant in various defense establishments. And in that particular piece, he's basically making a very simple argument, which is that Clausewitz is still relevant. There's a tendency to think about him, I'll give you his bio in a minute, but there's a tendency to think about him as someone who's from the past and whose theories are outdated or out of step or out of sync with technology. And Gray's essay was in general designed to counter that notion. But fortunately for you, along the way, he hits the major components of Clausewitz's theory and lays out for you what his thinking means and why, in fact, it's still significant. And so you can get sort of the cliff notes or the highlights of Clausewitz without having read the whole thing. And in a different way, if you haven't done the reading yet, the section from Mao actually is Mao. It's Mao's writings, but it's specific extracts. As I tried to say in the syllabus, be careful when you're reading it that you're getting 3 pages here and 4 pages there, and because I couldn't scan it in ways that blocked out what you didn't need to read. Sometimes you might wonder where the connections are. If you look at the page numbers, you'll see how it works. So first, let's talk about who Clausewitz was, and then we'll talk a little bit about what his theory is about. Okay, actually, correction. Before we, let me just briefly show you the outline for today. Again, this PowerPoint is available, so you can consult it. This is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about Clausewitz and the two, essentially the 2 large components of his theory, and then we'll talk about Mao and his 3 stages and 3 types. Those of you who've been in my Global History of Warfare class, some of this should sound familiar. That's okay. It'll stick more. Those of you who haven't seen this before, we'll see again when you take the Global History of War, and so you'll be better prepared for that section. All right, so let's start with. We'll start with Clausewitz himself. Clausewitz is Prussian, and he's Prussian at a very particular time. He was Prussian at a very particular time in European history, which is during the Napoleonic Wars. And he is part of a state that was defeated, unexpectedly, rapidly, violently defeated by Napoleon and subjugated to Napoleon's will for almost a decade. And Clausewitz, among other Prussians, resented this defeat, and especially the subjugation to Napoleon's will. And Clausewitz used that experience and that, if you will, opportunity to think about the nature of war. He looked at Napoleon as having arrived on the scene, clearly carrying some new kind of knowledge about the nature of war. And Clausewitz was trying to figure out what that was and why that particular knowledge had enabled Napoleon in so many ways. When the war was over, Clausewitz becomes an instructor in the Prussian, essentially the military academy, for senior officers, not for cadets. And he wrote what we now call On War, although quite famously, there's been a lot of research recently showing the extent of influence of his wife, Marie. And On War is, without question, the most influential treatise on war, per the title, in the world, including, as it says here on the slide, 33 different Chinese translations. You can't wander into a U.S. military service school and not have somebody talking to you about Clausewitz. It's just embedded in the culture. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean it's very well understood. It is a complex, long text. It was written in German, so reading it in English is sometimes a bit of a struggle. The translations can seem awkward. And furthermore, it was never finished. Many of the meaty chapters in the middle are clearly still drafts that have not been squared to the more polished book 1, which is the introduction. It's book 1 in German is more like chapter 1. And there are a lot of seeming gaps in the theory. But let me walk you through how it basically works. And you're going to have this on video, so if parts of it don't make sense, you can come back to it later. What Clausewitz does is he starts with the philosophical problem of the definition of war, but not the definition in the sense of the way we talked about it before, but more in the sense of what is war? What is its true nature? In sort of in a philosophical abstraction. And he concludes that it first and foremost is a duel, that it is a duel between two opponents, and that in the nature of things, one side is trying to impose its will on the other side through the application of force. He's not talking about diplomatic struggles, he's talking about war. That's what he's trying to understand. And when you're using force, it has its own implications. And so when you impose or trying to impose your will through force on your opponent, he will naturally try to resist that imposition and impose their will on you. And thus the duel will inevitably, in war's true nature, will escalate. That is, the amount of resources and effort and men and money and bodies that you throw into this duel will naturally escalate. And every time you escalate, your enemy has to escalate in response. And that's what he calls true war or ideal war. And by ideal in this sense, he doesn't mean in the English sense of preferred. He means it in the philosophical sense of its true nature. And then he says there are three buts in the real world. And those buts are, first, the political object. Like, what is it that we are increasing our effort in order to accomplish? Is it worth increasing the effort? Is there a calculation of costs and benefits that means we should continue to escalate our effort? That's the first but. The second but is what he calls friction, which is the impossibility of doing war the way you want it to happen. That is, there will always be things going wrong. He says something to the effect that the simplest thing in war is difficult. And it's a matter of space and time and the mobilization and movement of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, that there is no way this can all be synchronized in the way that you would intend for it to happen. And so that but becomes a limit on the capacity of war to endlessly escalate in its ideal form, that in its real form, it is restrained first by politics and second by the friction that is natural to war. And the third but, in some ways, actually combines the first two, but it also represents, in many ways, the summation of his theory, and that is what he calls the Trinity, or in fact calls the marvelous Trinity. And in this, he's essentially saying that there are impinging upon the normal dual, D-U-A-L, that is two-sided, two opponents, in a duel, D-U-E-L, that duality of war that goes to naturally mutual escalation, in reality exists in a much more complex universe. And that the three primary actors in that universe are the state, the people in the state, and the general combined with the army, but primarily through the mind of the general. And that each of those actors is fundamentally driven by a different component of the universe. The state, in theory, is driven by rational choice, which is determined, in this case, by the political end. What is the conflict attempting to achieve? What is its political goal? And that political goal should then govern the amount of effort and resources that you dedicate to the war. The people, says Clausewitz, represent the role of emotion in war. And that emotion can go either up or down. That is to say, the passions of the people might push the quote-unquote rational choice of the regime to further the effort in the war, or the disenchantment of the people with the war may in turn force their leadership to abandon the war and therefore de-escalate the amount of effort that goes into the war. And the passion can move either way. In Clausewitz's actual text, because he's writing about the French Revolution, he tends to focus on the escalation of passion, the consequences of the escalation of passion and the popular commitment to the war, because his immediate example is the French Revolution. But the theory goes either way. And the third is the general, and this is kind of the complicated one to explain, and it relates back to the problem of friction. That is to say, in the real universe where there are trees and roads and rain and mud and individual political will, I mean individuals with political ideas and motivations and horses that die and everything that can possibly go wrong will go wrong, there is an enormous element of chance and an enormous problem of management, and that the general's job is to seek to manage what Clausewitz calls the play of probability and chance in the application of force, because he is the one actually applying force on the battlefield. And that is an activity, Clausewitz says, of the soul. It's something that is, that's a get out of jail free word. He's using the word soul because it's hard to explain. And he says that it's something that you can't even always grasp. And again, he's got Napoleon in mind because he sees how Napoleon has that ability to understand how to manage friction, probability, and chance in a highly effective way. And so Clausewitz is trying to capture that aspect of warfare in referring to the play of probability and chance as an activity of the soul. And all of these have an effect of pushing down on that mutual escalation of the duality of war, because with friction and chance, there's no way that you can, seamlessly, easily, frictionlessly escalate war. And so, in fact, escalation is restrained by its very nature, by the very nature of the world. And it might be restrained by the passions of the people, or the disenchantment of the people. And it's definitely going to be restrained by the political object, that is the cost-benefit analysis that the state is conducting on war. And this statement of the Trinity represents the sort of culmination of his theory, of Clausewitz's theory about the nature of war, that to understand any given war, one must understand how these three poles are interacting. And over the course of a war in time, the nature of their interactions may change, because that true nature of war is still there, wanting to push its way up out of the Trinity, if you will, and into the philosophical ideal, because the dual seems to require that endless escalation in its true nature, but it will constantly be pulled back on and yanked on by the other three components of the Trinity. Now, when Clausewitz gets to discussing the ends of war, that is, in particular, the ends and means, which you're going to see we talk about on Thursday, the ends, ways, and means paradigm that modern strategists use. One of the things he's going to do is he's going to, in one sense, match each pole of the Trinity to a different way to achieve one's ends. And he identifies essentially three targets in an enemy. One is their military power, which is their armed forces. In his mind in the 19th century, he's thinking of the enemy armed forces as his primary, what he means by military power. The second thing is their country, the territory. And again, this is a 19th century sort of expansive territorial understanding of power. That is, the resources of a country are represented by its territory. And then third is the will of the enemy. So he identifies these three targets, which correspond roughly to the three poles of the Trinity, in the sense of the general is the army, the territory is the state, and the will is the people. And what Clausewitz ends up emphasizing in the majority of the text is focusing the application of force against the enemy's armed forces. He doesn't say that's the only way. And he talks about will a great deal, but in his mind at that time when he was writing, if you defeated the armed forces of the enemy, then all the others become vulnerable. the country becomes vulnerable. The will of the people becomes vulnerable through occupation by your army of that territory. And so he believed that the first goal of strategy, most of the time, not always, but was the destruction of the enemy's military power, from which all other things would follow. And I want you to keep that in mind, and I'll come back to that again on Thursday when we talk about how to critique these different theorists. All right, so now I want to move on to Mao and talk about a little bit about what his context and background is. Mao is often thought of through the terms of these, you see these three translated titles of on guerrilla warfare. He's often thought of as a theorist of guerrilla warfare. And in reality, he's a theorist of a good deal more. But let me provide you the context from which his theory develops, which will help you understand the direction that it takes. The first piece of context is, of course, that Mao was a part of a communist revolutionary movement inside China against what was then the Chinese nationalist government, which was a not a particularly good government. And there was a number of revolutionary movements against it, of which the communist one became the largest. And I don't want to go into the whole history of the political mobilization component of the Chinese communist movement. That's for a different class for a different day. But during that war between the Communist Revolutionary Army, the People's Liberation Army, the Red Army, and the Nationalist Chinese Army, the communists were badly defeated in the mid-30s and basically had to retreat. And this map represents what becomes a sort of legendary retreat. It's called the Long March, in which the Chinese revolutionary forces retreat deep into the interior of China and then shift to the north. And you can see these X's are major concentrations of Chinese Red Army forces that have been wiped out, and the rest are retreating in the Long March up into northern China. Now, I want you to note the dates. The Long March is occurring in 1934, 1935. So at this particular moment in time, in 34, 35, you have essentially a defeated Red Army in hiding. And at exactly that same moment, in the mid-30s, the Japanese are commencing, and then expanding their invasion of China, which by 1940 looks like this. That is to say, all of this sort of dark peach color territory is what the Japanese are occupying, the parts of China that the Japanese are occupying. And the area where the Red Army has retreated to is up in the literally in the mountains. And they are detached from the war against nationalist China for the most part at this moment. And they are detached from the war against Japan for the most part at this moment. And during this period, in 1935, 1936, this map is from 1940, but the lines don't change that much from 36. During this period, Mao is sitting there in the mountains. He's a major figure in the movement. He's not the only one, but he is a major figure in the movement. And he begins to theorize about how he would, with the Red Army, defeat the Japanese. Because he's trying to think about how does a peasant-based, non-industrial Chinese revolutionary army defeat a modern industrial power like Japan. And Japan is, of course, westernized its economy and its military and its industrial systems, and it has battleships and tanks and airplanes. And China is still very unindustrialized. It has attempted to industrialize. But that's the state of China. The revolutionary movement is very, very unindustrial. And virtually all the weapons they have are the ones they've stolen violently from nationalist forces. And so Mao is trying to think, how do I win in this? If I were to be leading the nation of China against the Japanese invasion, how would I win? And what he comes up with is a way of thinking about protracted war. And again, he becomes famous for the piece of it that's called guerrilla war. But the real strategic object in his mind is to protract the war, because the danger when fighting an industrially equipped enemy with a non-industrial equipped force yourself is that they would rapidly overwhelm you, and the war would be over. But that Mao believed that if he protracted the war, if he drags it on endlessly, he could simultaneously increase the political will of the people on his side, in sort of semi-Clausewitzian terms, right? The pull of the people, and degrade the will of the people on the enemy side. And that eventually, through protraction, he would destroy the will of his industrial equipped foe. And as their will weakened, the Chinese side would be accumulating material resources through successful small combats and reserving them, harboring them, saving them. And as the Japanese began to retreat and or to diminish the amount of resources they had committed because of a loss of will to this theater, that the Chinese would gradually increase their use of actual force to drive the Japanese out. That eventually there would be a more or less conventional offensive to drive the Japanese out. And the way he described all this was he put it into 3 stages. And I want to show you how each of the stages in theory would work. So in the first stage, and you can see, I hope you can see almost immediately how this corresponds to the actual map of the Japanese presence in China. That as the Japanese advance, that's the red side of the slide, as the Japanese advance into Chinese territory, they naturally create these salients. That's what the technical military term for this bulge in the line. And again, if you go back and look at the map, you can see what he was thinking of. This is what the Japanese advance naturally does in a very large country, is it creates these salients that stick out. And that during what Mao calls the enemy's strategic offensive, these salients would naturally emerge, and that we would use 3 kinds of war against this enemy advance. And each of these 3 kinds of war is going to be present in the other 3 phases. So there's 3 stages and 3 kinds, right? And each is present to a different extent or emphasis during each of the stages. So that during the enemy strategic offensive, we would use primarily mobile war, which is the regular forces of the Red Army, that is the organized and more or less well-equipped components of the Revolutionary Army, would attack along exterior lines in quick decision, essentially ambush attacks that would attack and retreat, but remaining on exterior lines, that is staying outside the bounds of the salient so that they don't get trapped by Japanese forces. And those forces would be supplied from bases, permanent bases, deep in the mountains, which especially northern China has a lot. There are many safe, very difficult operating environments in the interior of China that you could retreat to, and that those permanent bases would have to be defended. And then that would be the only form of the second kind of warfare, which is positional conventional warfare, that would be applicable during this phase. That is, if one of our permanent bases is threatened, we would actually probably have to fight a positional conventional fight to prevent the Japanese from taking it, or at least long enough that we could evacuate it, etc. But this is a very unimportant component in the first phase, that is positional conventional war, territorial war. And the third form of war, and again, this is the form that he becomes famous for, but it's only a tiny component of the overall theory, is guerrilla warfare behind the enemy lines. And that during the enemy advance, inside the salient, you would have forces essentially left behind or swallowed up, revolutionary forces left behind or swallowed up by the Japanese advance, and they would, from temporary bases that you would never defend, they would launch small-scale actions of sabotage, assassination, very small-scale ambush, and that if threatened, they would famously, drop their weapons, be in civilian clothes, and disappear into the civilian population. In the initial Japanese offensive, this would have a relatively small role, But as time goes on and you move into the second stage, where the enemy advance has exhausted itself, this is the phase that we are going to protract. We are going to extend and lengthen the war in this phase. And the primary instrument with which we will do that is the guerrilla form of war, the guerrilla form of war. And at the same time that those guerrillas are using violence inside enemy occupied territory in the form of sabotage, assassination, small-scale ambush, etc., they are also politically mobilizing that population so that they are drawing recruits by operating in the villages, in the peasant rural villages of China. They are going to be gaining loyalty and gaining recruits. And some of those recruits would then go up through a recruitment sphere and then end up in non-occupied China, joining the regular Red Army, which would continue to conduct small forms of mobile warfare, because occasionally the Japanese would launch some sort of attack or a raid or something like that, which would become a target for the Red Army to conduct, again, relatively small scale, bigger than guerrilla, but still smaller than big positional war attacks on that force. You see that here on the slide, the little tiny red arrow being attacked by mobile war. And again, the permanent bases in the mountains are mostly a repository for all of the arms, equipment, and ammunition that you cannot industrially build yourself, but which you are accumulating for your eventual third phase, which is the last phase, when, as Japanese will fragments and Chinese resources increase, men and material, eventually you can launch a full-on positional territorial counteroffensive that will thrust the Japanese out of China and restore Chinese independence. Now, this is essentially the larger frame of Mao's theory, and it becomes massively influential. It's published in 1936 in English. It's published in Chinese, and it's immediately translated by the revolutionary movement into English, and it moves around the world. And one of the things we talk about in the Global History of Warfare class is the extent to which this is copied and modified by other revolutionary movements around the world. But this three-phase or three-stage notion of how an insurgent movement can protract a war, degrade an enemy will, without having the industrial capacity or technological capacity of its opponent, and ultimately still win a war, becomes a highly influential model for the rest of the world to try to follow, again, with adaptations.